Assalamu alaikum. And once again, good evening, everyone, or depending on where you are in the world. Okay, so initially, when I used to teach late Ottoman history in particular, the caliphate question wasn't that significant to me as a person, but it started to become significant because even today, the sort of like political sort of like wranglings that exist regarding the terminology, the idea, or what the institution is, it's still fresh in the minds of people, even if it's skewed. So I was listening to a talk by Ed Hussein a few days ago on the new channel that is being set up by Andrew Neil. And when he was making a case regarding not allowing Shamima Begum to come back, he continuously used the idea of the caliphate question, young people being obsessed with the caliphate, and this sort of like idea of this like alien entity that is designed for the destruction of Western civilization and so forth, which I found really strange because as a historian and somebody who studies Ottoman history, we don't see the Ottoman Caliphate in that fashion. So this was a thing that once again, it's strange, it re-emerged in my imagination for those of us who study history. The other thing is obviously that the emergence of ISIS in particular was the manner in which they shaped their caliphate, the imagination of their caliphate, which is strange. They built it on two premises. One was on the Sykes and Picot Agreement, which took place in the Arab provinces after the collapse of the Ottomans. But what's interesting is ISIS never spoke about the Ottoman Caliphate in their narrative. Not once did they make any references to the Ottomans. It was almost like the Ottomans were seen as this declined, decadent entity, which the Arabs had no real interest in. And there's a reason for that, because many of the fighters who were from the indigenous areas of Iraq and Syria in particular were indoctrinated by the Ba'athist regimes to some degree, that had still this sort of like internalized Arab nationalism in the way that they saw the Ottoman past. What they spoke about, and when we look at Baghdadi in particular, he dressed, and he even used his symbology, as if he was an Abbasid caliph. He dressed in all in black, and he made all the references of Raqqa, because Raqqa was one of the capital cities of the Abbasid Caliphate in the past. And it's intriguing how he used that sort of symbology. So he sort of like bypassed 400 years of Ottoman history regarding the question. Now, Professor Hugh Kennedy at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, has written a book on the history of the caliphate in Western academia. There are many Muslim scholars who have written about this. But what is consistent is both in the Muslim context and in the Western academic context, the Ottoman question is one which there seems to be the biggest sort of like hole or gaps in regards to what was the Ottoman Caliphate. There are, in Western academia, amongst Ottoman historians, this was never a really important question for them. So they never emphasized on the importance of the Caliphate question. And in the Turkish Republic in particular, the Caliphate was never spoken about simply because it was positioned as in opposition to the creation of the Turkish Republic. So as a result of that, the Ottoman Caliphate was seen in that sense. So what you start to see is because of this sort of like absence of the study of the Caliphate in this way, in the Ottoman context, very few was known about it, or very little, sorry, shall I say, I should improve my English, was known about this. And Hugh Kennedy, who writes about the Ottoman Caliphate in his book on the Caliphate published by Penguin Books, still, when I spoke to him, because he's a colleague of mine, he accepted the fact that his understanding on the Ottomans and the Ottoman Caliphate was exceptionally weak, and it was dependent on secondary sources. And the majority of the scholars' works on the Ottoman Caliphate is very outdated. So as a result, I've come to speak to you about that. And I just wanted to make that really, stress that point to you guys of why this is important. So just a quick overview before we start to the late period, which is the Ottomans transition from a beylik. A beylik is basically a principality. So the early Ottomans are not caliphs. It's important to understand that. So Orhan Ghazi, Osman Ghazi, Murad Khudavandigar, these people are not caliphs. What they are is, in the early period, they're not even sultans. They become sultanic as the empire moves along, and mainly when they expand into what we call Rumeli, which is known as the sort of like Christian territories of Western Anatolia, which is today's Turkey and the Balkans. And we have to appreciate is Fatih's conquest of Istanbul was seismic to some degree, because the conquest of Istanbul sort of for the first time in not only in Ottoman history, but in Islamic history, a major center of Christendom was defeated by the Muslims. Muslims had defeated Christians before. They had defeated the Romans before. They had defeated the Persians, who were great empires of themselves. But to actually take a center of Christendom, this was unparalleled and unprecedented in Islamic history. And so once Istanbul had become a center, the nature of power under the Ottoman state changes. The Ottoman state is now what we would call loosely the empire, and they started to think within these imperial terms. Fatih now starts to reconstruct Constantinople as a city to become in Istanbul. Hagia Sophia now becomes a mosque with the depletion of the Christian populations, and the sort of like as the power, the center of power is defeated in Constantinople. No longer can the upkeeping of many of the buildings that were facilitated by power could be done, and so the Muslims gradually take these places over. Fatih then builds a Topkapi Palace, the Fatih Mosque, and so forth, in an attempt to Islamize the city. But it's not until Selim, okay, that we start to see a significant shift in the mentality of the Ottomans, in which they become a caliphate. So Selim, who's in continual war with the Safavids, even though he defeats the Safavids, he doesn't destroy them. But when he fights the Mamluks in Syria, Selim has an opportunity to defeat the Mamluks in Cairo. And probably one of the problems that Selim had was that the Mamluks had the capacity to delegitimize Istanbul as a power. And we see this in the case of Jem Sultan. So Jem Sultan is the brother of Bayezid, who was the father of Selim. And during Bayezid's period, Jem Sultan, when he tries to become Sultan in Istanbul, doesn't become successful. He goes to Cairo and he speaks to the Caliph as a way of trying to appeal to him, as a way of trying to put pressure on Istanbul. And so Istanbul is now aware that even though the Caliphate is nominal and it's hostage to the Mamluks, it still has an emotional capacity to sort of like critique and pressurize Istanbul. And so Selim, probably with this mindset, when he goes to war with the Mamluks, who were not supportive in fighting the Safavids, has this in mind. And so when he defeats the Mamluks in Syria in particular, he has a choice to make. And him and his soldiers make a choice, which is, does he continue going down south because the Mamluks retreated very quickly, or does he return back to Istanbul because a lot of his soldiers were exhausted and tired and they didn't want to continue the expedition? But Selim decided to kick on because he saw this as an opportunity, and rapidly makes it to Cairo and defeats the Mamluks there. And now we have a situation. The situation is this: the Selim, who is in charge of Anatolia, Istanbul, the Balkans, now defeated the Mamluks. He's in charge of the Hijaz, Quds, and Bilad al-Sham and Cairo. What does he do in regards to authority? Does he give the authority? Does he do what the Mamluks did, which is to give like sort of like patronage to a caliph in Cairo? But that would make him look weak in Istanbul, and his state and his empire would collapse overnight in regards to the Sultan being seen as being weak. So it seems, and we can't really prove any of this because we don't have the evidence for it, but it seems the oral urban legend is that Al-Mutawakkil actually then transfers the caliphate over to Selim. Selim takes him to Istanbul and puts him under house arrest. And what's interesting is, even though Selim dies, Mutawakkil outlives him and then is still there under Suleiman the Magnificent. But it seems that from this moment onwards, the claim is that the Ottomans are now a caliphate. Now, why? Another interesting thing is, why would they have claimed to be a caliphate? The chances are, although we can't prove this, but the chances are, is that the Ottomans could never be seen of doing to the caliphate what the Mongols did So the idea that Selim was like the Mongol invasion, who came down to Cairo and totally trashed it and killed the caliph, is unthinkable. There was for a long time in Abbasid history a position that tried to make sure that the Seljuks never tried to encroach upon the Abbasids regarding the caliphate question. And this is why we have a host of works by the likes of Ghazali and Mawardi and Bakilani producing these works. Scholars are arguing that these works filtered into the circles in Istanbul, and so the scholars were aware of this. Anyway, when Selim is declared a caliph, well, now what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to be a caliph, right? So you start to see a lot of work, and Hussein Yilmaz has written a book on this, redefining, now what's it called? I think it's called The Mystical Caliphate or something like that, or in which he talks about how Sufism, in particular, and the Sufi ulama in particular, start to create a new theorization and conceptualization of what a Khilafah means in regards, or the Caliphate means in regards to the Ottoman context. And what they talk about is good governance, being morally upright, and what it means to be a leader. So the moral upright leader. So in that sense, in some ways, not only are they reminding Selim, but they basically now placing they institutionalizing a culture of the Ottoman Caliphate in this context, right? And then Selim's son Suleiman, when he becomes the next leader he then conquers Baghdad and so forth, and the Ottomans become comprehensive in regards to being the Caliphate in that sense. Now, obviously, we can see that in the case of Suleiman and Selim in particular, there is no question or debate about a bay'ah being given. Like, who would it have been given by? So when Selim conquers Egypt, is the bay'ah given to him by the people of Cairo? Should the bay'ah be given to him by the old Caliph al-Mutawakkil? Or in Selim's case, is the bay'ah given to him by people in Istanbul? And here you can see the complexity of the question. And we really, as historians, don't have an answer for this, because we really don't know how this played out. What it probably looks like is that everybody just accepted the reality, which was Selim was the most powerful man in the region. And the idea of rejecting him as caliph just didn't make sense in that sense. But what we see is a transition as time goes on, and the Janissaries, who were the military militia which the Ottomans used to use, became exceptionally powerful in Istanbul. And after the ulama become powerful in Istanbul. And so basically what happens is, when the Ottomans stopped the fratricide, by stopping fratricide, what they did is they created an environment in which no longer would Ottoman sultans be sent outside of Istanbul to learn their trade, and instead all the Ottoman sultans were left in the palace. And the idea was that technically the oldest Ottoman sultan would now be the caliph in that sense. And this was a huge shift. And the problem was that at the time of Genç Osman in the 17th century, he was 14 or 15 years old. And so now we have a situation, we have a very young kid who's in a position of power. He's the oldest son in the house of Osman to some degree. His uncle could be caliph, but there were some technicalities regarding this, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. And so what happens is the ulama and the Janissaries now become exceptionally important as these institutions in the Ottoman Empire. And Genç Osman later on, because of some of his policies, is then executed by the Janissaries. And we start to see a shift in Ottoman policy, asking the question, who is the caliph per se? Because this was the first time that the caliph had been killed in the Ottoman context, right? And so the question now that emerges, and Osman has the same name as Uthman bin Affan, and so what you see is this trauma in the Ottoman mind. But what we start to realize from this moment onwards, and the point I guess I'm making, is that the Janissary and the ulama in Istanbul in particular, and the political elites, were part of the bay'ah giving process. And they were now choosing which Ottoman son should be in power. And if he were not to abide by the culture of the time, then it very possibly he could be killed. And so we moved from a system of fratricide to regicide in that sense. People need to understand that this is still a very violent world, and sometimes people can't appreciate that how much what the world was like at this moment globally. So it's very difficult to explain. But what we start to see is the notion in Ottoman culture of the idea of what is the prerogatives of a sultan? What does it mean to be a caliph? What does it mean to be in power? What does it mean to be out of power? What is the expectations of a caliph? What is the expectations of a caliphate to some degree? So what we start to see in totality is, while there are moments of violence in Ottoman history, at the same time what we're seeing is an evolution of the institution of the caliphate. And by the 18th century, in 1774, when the Ottomans are continuously being defeated by the Russians, they start to realize that the institution of the caliphate is really important to Muslims as a way of rallying Muslim support. So in the Ottoman context, what they came to realize is the objective of the caliphate was, one, to protect all those within the Ottoman domains, two, to support the interests of Muslims, and three, to make sure that the Sharia is implemented in the way that it was so fit in a decentralized area. But the appeal to the caliphate was now being made because of the threat that was coming from outside. And it's interesting because in this sense, the Ottomans had successfully now, up until this moment, institutionalized an idea that the caliphate was just as holy as Makkah, Medina, and Aqsa. So I need you guys to understand what's going on here in that sense, right? And so this was now being exercised in a way to try to get people to go in the war effort, and people were fighting and fighting the Russians and so forth. In 1774, Küçük Kaynarca is the Ottoman defeat. So the Crimea is lost to the Russians. And for the first time in Ottoman history, major Muslim territory is lost to non-Muslims, which is the Russians in this occasion. And this really put into questions, it really questioned the Ottoman case of, can they protect Muslims as a caliphate, which is the objective of the caliphate. So on the one hand, the caliphate was a glorious title that they exercised and used into Muslims around the world. But on the other hand, it became an exceptional burden, the sort of paradox of being caliphs in that sense, as in terms of having the expectation that continuously it was their prerogative as caliphs to protect their brothers throughout the Muslim world in particular, but specifically in the Ottoman domains. So Küçük Kaynarca is a treaty where for the first time we see it written down that the Russians recognize Abdulhamid I as a caliph. And this is intriguing. So there seems to be not only now an internalization regarding the Ottomans being a caliphate within the minds of Muslims in the Ottoman domains, there's now an acceptance by the foreign powers in regards to the Ottomans being a caliphate. And the reason why this is important is because earlier on in the Indo-Pak region in particular, and certain principalities in China and so forth, were quite critical of whether the Ottomans were legitimate caliphs. But by now, this totally changes, because when the foreign powers are accepting that the Ottomans are a caliphate, and when the Ottomans are recognizing that they're a caliphate, you start to see Muslims in the Indo-Pak region in particular also accepting this as a case, because the colonial powers have accepted this as a case. So by now, globally, we're starting to see that the major powers, both Muslim and non-Muslim, are starting to accept the Ottomans as a caliphate. And this becomes the first documentation that does that. What's intriguing here is the complexity of the prerogatives of the caliph in terms of their jurisdiction in the Ottoman domains and out. So in the case of Küçük Kaynarca, the Crimea is lost. So the Ottomans have very little jurisdiction in terms of telling the Muslims what to do there. But in the document, what it suggested was that the Ottomans could pick and choose the Grand Mufti, and that the people of the Crimea would accept Abdulhamid as the caliph, even though they were not under the Ottoman Caliphate anymore. And this brought into question the idea of what it means to be part of the Ummah. So now in the Ottoman context, you have Ummah in the Ottoman domains, and you had Ummah outside the Ottoman domains. And then you had Ummah who was in the Crimea, who was lost, who were previously part of the Ottoman domains, but are no longer part of the Ottoman domains. So how do you make sense of this? How does this work? So you have like these two, what you could call like institutions in Islam. One is a political institution, and one is a social institution in that sense, that has a political component, which is the Ummah in of itself. And what's interesting is the Ottomans are now trying to grasp the complexity of this question in that sense, which I feel sometimes when I'm teaching this today, that a lot of young people haven't come to terms with, one, what does it mean to belong to Ummah? We see this in the case of Palestine in particular, that what does it mean to be part of an inclusive and exclusive identity marker, especially with nation states? And two, what is the caliphate question and in relation to this? And there seems to be still a lot of stigma around this rather than any proper academic sort of like discussions. So after Abdulhamid dies, we have Salim III. So just to break it down, because I know I'm going a little bit quick, so let me just start again. So Yavuz Sultan Salim in 1516 becomes caliph. And then his son Suleiman the Magnificent continues. Then 100 years later, Genç Osman, at 14 years old, is the first caliph who's killed by the Janissaries and with ulama support. And from that moment onwards, the Janissaries and the ulama are choosing caliphs, whereas before it was just done by succession. And now in Sultan Abdulhamid I period in 1774, we see another evolution in the caliphate ideology, in the sense of it transitioning, where now the Ottomans are making a claim for being caliphs to Muslims outside the Ottoman domains and getting the foreign powers to accept them. Selim III, who after Abdulhamid I becomes in next, and one of the things that Selim III is trying to do is now trying to refashion the Ottoman state, which is to reform it. And part of the Ottoman Reformation was in relation to the Ottoman Caliphate question. And so Selim was now presented as a mujaddid. Many of the Sufi tariqas were presenting Selim as a mujaddid, restorer of the faith, and as a caliph. And the argument was that the Ottomans have had the caliphate for so long, and Allah in particular is choosing caliphs one by one. And so as a result of that, there should be absolute obedience to the caliph. And we now start to get something really interesting in the sort of like theological debates, which is the idea of absolute obedience to the caliph. The reason why Selim required absolute obedience, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, because the Ottomans are trying to centralize the state. But in an attempt to centralize the state, there were many institutions like the Janissaries, like some members of the ulama, like the Wahhabi factions in Hijaz, like some people in Egypt, like the Mamluks in Baghdad, who were rejecting the Ottomans' attempts to centralize. And one of the points I made before is that Ottoman authority was based on negotiation. In that sense, what we learn even regarding the caliphate theory is the idea that obedience can't be demanded. Obedience has to be given. And in that sense, if obedience is given, then there is a sense of negotiation that takes place that is recognized here. And so what happens is, but Selim now, in his need to centralize the domains, the idea is the verse in the Quran is propagated, which is obey Allah, obey the messenger and those in authority from amongst you. He's the caliph. And so people have to be obedient. And if they are not obedient, then the fear is that the Russians are going to attack the Ottomans, and the sort of like Ottoman state is under threat. So you start to see the complexities that are emerging. With the Wahhabi question, the Wahhabi revolts in particular, they really put into question the idea of the caliphate, because they take the holy places, Mecca and Medina. And so then the question is, in order to be a caliph, does Mecca and Medina need to be part of your jurisdiction? Because one of the things that the Ottomans made the claim was that they were caliphs and protectors of the holy places, but the holy places had been lost. So how did the ulama now fashion this perspective, which is the idea that can you be caliph and not have Mecca and Medina under your authority? And so here you start to see another dynamic. And many of the ulama made the case that Mecca and Medina didn't have to be part of your authority, but simply that the caliphate needed to exist as a Muslim entity, as a way of giving global Muslim agency, which is really interesting, the way that they put this out there. On the same token, we now start to see emerging from the Arab provinces the idea that the Khalifa needs to be from the Quraysh, that this tribe, it has to come from this. And this is something that even the British were promoting at the time, which is really intriguing how these ideas like coincide with one another. But obviously, Mehmed Ali Pasha in Egypt, as we mentioned before, crushes the Wahhabis in that sense, and then Makkah and Medina come back to the Ottomans, and the Ottomans maintain this. So once again, we're starting to see an evolution, and this is really interesting because there's a host of questions that I want you to think about in terms of what happened in Ottoman history. First is the question of bay'ah. Second is the question of the Sultanate and the Caliphate. Third is the idea of is the Caliph sacred in the fact that the Caliph was killed. Third is the issue of obedience, and what does that mean to be obedient to a Caliph. Fourth is the issue of the Holy Lands needing to be under the authority of the Caliph. So all of these questions are really interesting, and for those of us who do Ottoman history, we look at this in a very different way than I guess sometimes young Muslims do in particular, because they're not presented with any of these challenges in this way. Okay, so after the death of Mahmud II and this whole idea of placing emphasis on obedience of the Caliphate, we start to see the Tanzimat period in particular. And this is the period of Reformation, which I think is important for everyone to understand. So it's during the period of the Reformation that we start to see an intensification of the question of the Ottoman Caliphate. In particular, what we see, and the reason why this is important is because early Ottoman historians in the West made the case that in the 19th century onwards that the Ottomans was secularizing. Now Ottoman historians, especially in Turkey, are making the argument that this wasn't the case. And in fact, what was happening was an extensive Sunniization of the Ottoman state taking place. The Ottomans were aware of foreign encroachment. The Ottomans were trying to negotiate the foreign encroachment, but at the same time, they were now doubling down on emphasizing themselves as being the only Muslim entity in the world that was resisting colonialism. And as a result of that, they emphasized heavily on their Sunni component, and they emphasized heavily on them being caliphs. And they emphasized heavily on the caliphate as an institution, which gave them the authority to push forward their reforms to some degree. And surprisingly, this happens in the Tanzimat period. So it's one of the things I want you guys to consider, because as Ottoman historians, we're noticing this, but this shift hasn't happened in the Muslim mindset, which is that the Tanzimat period is a strange hybrid period, where on the one hand, there's the intervening of colonialism, and on the other hand, there is a excessive form of resistance in which there is a need of doubling down on the Sunni identity. And this is happening like at the same time. So there is like an internal struggle going on. It's during this moment that Hagia Sophia becomes institutionalized as the Caliphate Mosque, as the mosque where the caliphs are now inaugurated and given bay'ah in that mosque. So a lot of people didn't realize when the question of Hagia Sophia went back to a mosque from a museum, in Turkey, the mindset had nothing to do with Fatih's conquest. For them, the mindset was the Tanzimat period. For them, they felt like, you know, there was a particular culture in the Tanzimat period that was institutionalized, and the Turkish Republic took that away from them, meaning that this was not, Hagia Sophia wasn't any mosque, it was the mosque of power in Istanbul. It was the mosque in which the caliph was inaugurated, and it was the mosque in which the Jummah khutbahs were given, where the caliph would come to do his job, the Jummah in particular. And so for them, it's interesting, the memories are different. Now, what happened in the Western discourse is because they took it all the way to Fatih's conquest, it sort of shifted the Muslim mentality of not realizing that for the Turks in particular, this is a 19th century question. It was never a question of Fatih's conquest in that sense. So what we start to see, like if you go in Hagia Sophia, the majority of the calligraphy in Hagia Sophia is 19th century. The big discs, they were 19th century discs. The calligraphy in the dome in of itself the permission was given by Abdulhamid, the Tanzimat Khalifa, in which it says Allah is neither east nor west, you know, and so forth. And the idea of making the case that this is symbolic in that sense, that Islam is, you know, is for the whole world and so forth. And it's in this moment that they start to build more mosques, they start to build fountains and so forth as the prerogative of the caliph. And once again, the question starts to emerge about the idea of what it means to be a caliph, especially now because there's an internal contestation in Istanbul. And the internal contestation is between the Sultan, who is caliph, and the Sublime Porte, which is the institution of what you would call the minister's office, the Grand Vizier's office. And in the Tanzimat period, a lot of the authority went into the office of the Sublime Porte, in which the Sultan was only perceived as being a token. And this is important and interesting because this question keeps remaining, which is how much authority should the Sultan have as Caliph? And what does that mean in terms of throughout Islamic history, we've had moments where certain sultans and caliphs have been simply symbolic and so forth. So in the Tanzimat period, we are seeing an internal contestation. So we're seeing two contestations. We're seeing a contestation regarding the caliphate, regarding the encroachment of Western influence. And we're seeing a contestation on a practical level internally between the office of the Grand Vizier and the Caliph himself. The office of the Grand Vizier is an office that was delegated, but because the office of the Grand Vizier as an institution perceived the Sultan himself, especially Abdul Aziz, as being a bit wayward in his thinking, that they sort of like diminished his level of authority so that he couldn't create damage in that sense. And so this is the complexities that we're seeing. When Abdulaziz dies, we see the emergence of Sultan Abdulhamid, and this is now the movement towards, for the first time in Islamic history, we can say, a constitutional caliphate in the modern context with a parliamentary system. And this is really unique to see this. We haven't seen this before. Now, Hussein Yilmaz, Baki Tezcan, these are historians who make the case that the Ottomans did have constitutional traditions. So you remember when I mentioned Genç Osman, that the idea that Genç Osman could be killed by the Janissary with the support of the ulama, or that there is a fatwa that can remove the Sultan from power as caliph, is an indication that there are some traditions in the pre-modern period that were constitutional in the pre-modern context. And in that sense, the Ottomans are accustomed to sort of like checks and balances. One of the things I want you guys to always remember is that the sultans in Ottoman history were not absolutists. They were always nervous and afraid in regards to for their life, because one mistake and you'd be taken out internally, right? So, and what historians are saying, contemporary historians and historians at the time, like Alim Jevdet Pasha, is that these mechanisms at the time made the caliph feel accountable because there was a pressure that could be applied to them. And fundamentally, the most extreme pressure would have been that they could have lost their lives in that sense. And that is perceived as some sort of like what you could call constitutional tradition prior to modern constitutionalism, right? Because a lot of Muslims always ask me, why didn't the Ottomans have constitutionalism before in that sense? So 1876, Abdulhamid II comes under the ticket of a constitutional caliphate. Why does this happen? Because people want to know what the prerogatives of the person in power are. We have a new Ottoman Empire. We have a more literate society. We have a society which is becoming more urbanized. We have a society which is shifting from being subjects to citizens. And so the gap between authorities and the people are becoming smaller. So whereas in the past, the authorities just made the decisions and the people just followed. Now you started to see a more closer relationship between society and those in power. And we start to see the emergence of what we call modern day public opinion. And so people are now starting to ask, what is the objectives of power? What does it mean to be caliph? What are his prerogatives? What does it mean to be a grand vizier? What is the role of the tax collector? What is the role of the judge? What is the role of the administrators? So as a result of that, the Ottomans create this, what you could call constitution, as a way of explaining to people their new relationship between power and themselves. 2 years later, Abdulhamid closes the parliament, and mainly because one of the problems they had in the parliamentary system was a slow decision-making process. The parliament was supposed to function as a form of a shura council, but at the same time, the parliament was also designed to operate as a check on absolute sultanic authority and absolute authority of any institution in the Ottoman domains, whether that be the military or whether that be the ulama, in the sense of making sure that no single institution can be in absolute power that could be to the detriment of the Ottoman domains. And so the parliament was supposed to work as a sort of like an emotional check to have these discussions in the parliamentary setup. There were a lot of debates whether the Ottomans should have a parliament or not. A lot of people talk about the ulama were anti-constitution, anti-parliament. This is not true. What we're starting to see now is that the ulama were very pro-constitutionalism and pro-parliament. there were some concerns, and those concerns were mainly political. There were a few members of the ulama, I'm not going to say they weren't, who did believe that this was not allowed in Islam and this was haram. But the opinions were varied in that sense. And the Ottomans went through this process. And so the Ottomans, when they have the constitutional parliamentary system, in Ottoman Turkish, this is called meşrutiyet, which means the conditional government. So they are actually calling it the conditional government. And what happens is, sorry, okay. Okay, so I don't want to blow you all away. So what happens is basically, is that Abdulhamid realizes that the parliamentary system in particular is slowing down the decision-making process. And as a result, they lost the war against the Russians. So he closes down the parliament by suggesting that as caliph, he can close down the parliament. The reason why this becomes important is because in 1909 and 8, when the Young Turk Revolution happens, they make the case that Abdulhamid as a caliph doesn't have the authority to do that. That in the end of the day, the way that it should be the constitution, and then the constitutional government, and then the caliph in that order, which is quite intriguing. What Abdulhamid does in his period though, when he closes the parliament, is he still emphasizes on himself being the caliph, but not only caliphs internally, but caliphs around the world. And so what we also see amongst the ulama, which is really fascinating, is this idea of having two possible political systems in Islam. One is a shura-based system with a parliament and constitution, and two is an authoritarian constitutional system where there's more prerogatives and power in the hands of the Sultan, being a stoic leader. If you read the works of Muhammad Asad, it's really fascinating when he's talking about Pakistan's constitution, in particular before when the first Pakistani state was created. And Muhammad Asad talks about these two ideas, which is intriguing because he's mentioning something that obviously he knows about existed before. And even Iqbal, when he talks about the parliamentary system, you start to realize that they have actually been looking at the Ottoman system. They don't say one is, they both make the argument that both of these systems are possible. It just comes down to the political culture of the people at the time, which is intriguing. And we see a lot of these works in the Ottoman period as well. What Abdulhamid does is he emphasizes on the idea of Ittihad Islam, the idea of Muslim loyalty, the necessity of Muslims pulling together, the necessity of creating an ummatic paradigm of which it was based on an enigmatic sultan in that sense. And this had never been used before in Ottoman history to do this. So this was unique. And as a result of that, when Abdulhamid sort of like promoted the idea of being an upright, just caliph, not only did he promote the institution of the caliphate as being powerful, he also promoted the idea of him being religious, of him being pious, of him being just. And so in the global Muslim imagination, there was the idea of not only of the expectations of the institution of the caliphate, but also the expectations of the caliph himself. And these are two different things. So we have, I started to notice in the works of the ulama, there are works on what it means to have a caliphate and what it means to be a caliph. And these are two different things. And we start to see the emergence of that in the period of Abdulhamid II. Abdulhamid obviously dies, he's removed because of the Young Turk Revolution, and now we have the return of a constitutional caliphate in which the argument is made that the caliph does not have any authority over Muslims around the world and only has authority regarding Muslims in the domains. And the Ottomans tried to do damage limitation. But in World War I, the Ottomans once again tried to use the institution of the caliphate as a way of rallying the Muslims around the world to protect the institution of the caliphate. And by now, in World War I, what's interesting is the institution of the caliphate in the minds of the Ottomans has been institutionalized for sure, just like Makkah and Medina and Aqsa. That is what is ingrained in the minds of people. And you can see the emergence of this in the Indo-Pak region with the emergence of the Khilafat Committee. The Khilafat Committee are heavily involved in trying to, so you see in India, and even especially in the Bengal region and in Delhi in particular and parts of Punjab, you start to see a huge movement of Muslim intellectuals in particular who are trying to galvanize people for the caliphate. Now, Muslims didn't send soldiers over, but they send over a lot of money And a lot of Muslims from the Indo-Pak region in particular sent over, women were selling their bangles and things like this as a way of trying to support the Ottoman war effort. And there was an expectation and the hope that the Ottomans would win. The problem was that in the Indo-Pak region, they didn't realize or appreciate the complexities of what was happening in the ground in World War I. A lot of the information was coming from the British, and British propaganda, and war is about propaganda in of itself. And so, after the Hijaz is lost and Aqsa is lost and so forth, there's a huge confusion in terms of what's going to happen and what happens after that. During the War of Independence, many Muslims in India have the hope that Mustafa Kemal will become the caliph, because they start to see this complexity amongst the Turks, in which you have two now governments. You have the Istanbul government, where there was an occupation by the Allied forces in Istanbul, and the Ankara government. And so you have these two governments now, and the hope was by Muslims that Mustafa Kemal would become caliph. What's interesting in this moment is we start to see the abolishment of the Sultanate. Many Muslims around the world were not shocked that the Sultanate was abolished, while Muslims in Istanbul were making the case that if this is an attempt to abolish the caliphate by abolishing the Sultanate, Muslims around the world thought that this was going to become a caliphate where people were now going to be elected, and Mustafa Kemal would be the first elected caliph, and no longer would we have a monarchy. So Muslims were critical of the monarchy system, and thinking that this would be a system where the caliph was elected. And Muslims in Istanbul saw this as a ploy to abolish the caliphate by abolishing the Sultanate, because for so long the Sultanate was the only institution which knew how to be caliphs in that sense, right? And then in 1924, as you guys know, Mustafa Kemal and the Kemalists, shall I say, they abolished the caliphate to the shock of Muslims around the world. There is an attempt in 1931 in Jerusalem to re-establish the caliphate. And so the ex-caliph, Abdulhamid, comes to Jerusalem in the hope that they can re-establish the caliphate. We have Ali Johar, who comes to Jerusalem, and he's buried in Jerusalem, I think. And Iqbal is also there, and the Mufti of Jerusalem is there. And the two main questions that they're talking about is Aqsa and the caliphate question. And they couldn't resolve any of the two, because at the time Muslims were quite disunited in that sense. Then the hope was that the daughter of Abdulhamid would marry the son of the Nizam of Hyderabad, the richest Muslim in the world and the most symbolic Muslim in the world. And by joining them, that Muslims would once again become galvanized and unified in an attempt to re-establish the caliphate. But this also didn't happen. And so afterwards they got divorced, and she moved to her daughter, I think, was in London, and she refused to ever come back to these parts of the world. And so then you have the abolishment of the caliphate, and so now you have this vacuum. And it's from this moment onwards that you see the ulama in particular, who are very pro-caliphate, who start to encourage the debate about the re-establishment of the caliphate as a way of being attached to the question. And so you start to now see from this moment onwards the emergence of what we would call Muslim revivalist movements, and especially after World War II, we start to see this kicking on. And so, yeah, so that's basically it. Once again, I know I've given you guys a lot of information. Hopefully you can watch this again. But yeah, I'm ready for the Q&A.